Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedicase, and this is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so you're invited to come think with me. This is a podcast of conversations, not interviews. People always say, let's do this is an interview. It's a conversation because it's more like a podcast than just a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, here are all the steps in someone's argument. No, I wanna have pushback, I wanna have a genuine conversation, so I am gonna nitpick about that. These are conversations in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. Today's episode is really, really special. I have with me again Dr. Joshua Sijuwade, and we're gonna be talking about theistic modal realism. It's wild. There's so much to cover. I'm so excited to get into it. We're going to be talking about David Lewis. We're going to be talking about classical theism, neoclassical theism, all sorts of good stuff. So stay tuned. It's going to be fantastic. Before we jump in, though, I want to thank everyone over on Patreon. If you like this podcast, if it's your favorite, if it's your top 5, your top 10, please consider supporting the podcast. I would love to do this full time. I'd love to start traveling. Got some sweet equipment to do in-person interviews, conversations, not interviews. I'm the worst. So you guys can make that happen. And many of you already are making that happen. So if you enjoy this podcast, please consider supporting me on Patreon. You can find the link in the description. And then another way to support me, pretty excited about this one too, is to check out our sponsor, Biblios Clothing Company. So if you look in the description, wherever you're getting this, whether on YouTube or Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever, you can find a link to bibliosclothing.com. And you can get a 10% discount on all their clothes. If you type in, let me see, this is my first time trying it, so I'm stumbling through here, guys. bibliosclothing.com/discount/Parker, and it's all caps, Parker. And so you can get a sweet shirt like this one that I'm wearing right now. It's awesome. It's about the Great Commission, Matthew 28:18, and it's got Matthew in Greek. It's amazing. Matthew Toys. It's fantastic. So go check out bibliosclothing.com, Biblios Clothing Company, and it's bibliosclothing.com. You can check that out. You can find awesome clothes for men and women. They are coming up with even more new designs. The designs are fantastic, but check them out. And if you use the link that is in my description, let them know that I sent you. You'll get 10% off, and it makes me look good. So if you want to support the podcast, become a Patreon supporter, a patron, or go to bibliosclothing.com/discount/Parker. Find both those links in the description. That would be huge. All right. Before we jump in, I just want to say Joshua Sijuwade is the man. This dude is awesome. We were talking a little bit offline about his study habits, and a lot of his study habits match up with mine. So anyone giving me crap about my study habits, take it up with him. But this is going to be really like cutting edge conversation. So think hard and follow the arguments. Don't do any reductionistic, this is just that, or this is just that. It's tough and it's tricky and it is like cutting, bleeding edge stuff. So here we go. Let's jump in. Josh, man, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
Parker, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be back. Thank you.
Yeah, dude. So you first sent me this paper because I was talking about David Lewis and modal realism, and you said I had a paper on that, and no surprise there because you have a paper on everything. So you just pull out and I got a paper on that, which is fantastic, and I love that. But we first I first wanted to talk to you about theistic modal realism. That is, in modal realism, a la David Lewis, there's all these concrete worlds. And, I wanted to see how planning and his ontological argument stack up against those. But then I read your paper, and the paper is The Metaphysics of Theism, a Classical and Neoclassical Synthesis. And it's just so, so, so fascinating. So we got to talk about that as well. How'd you first, that's kind of a bold statement, man. Like you're synthesizing these two, disparate views. How'd you first even come to want to do that?
Yeah, so so this was sort of in my research for other things. So I've sort of the way my research projects have gone is I've just stumbled onto issues. So when I was researching something else, I just then realized, oh, that's very interesting. This can be utilized in this context. And then I've done that, and then it sort of led on to something else. And so I was researching this. it must have been on the Trinity or something related to that. And I started just being interested generally in the idea of modal realism and modality, and sort of the metaphysics of modality, and understanding what these things are. Are they, abstract objects, or are they concrete objects? And I just really was interested in David Lewis's idea, specifically because of how influential he's been in contemporary philosophy. So I just felt, okay, given his influence, let me actually go and read his stuff, and let me try and see what he's saying. And then just going a little bit deeper into his work, I realized that some of the things he's saying can be utilized in the context of this classical neoclassical theism debate. Because I sort of, prior to sort of going into the research in Lewis and other things related to that, I was intuitively in a place of thinking that I felt there was a false dichotomy here, in that you either a classical theist or you're either a neoclassical theist, but you can't be both. And I mean, most people would say, what the hell are you talking about, be both?
Right.
They seem to be contradictory. But I just felt like there is a way to bring these things together. And my sort of idea was, and as we sort of walk through the paper, of saying, I think it's not helpful having these two camps. I think we just all can go under the umbrella of being a theist, someone who believes in God. But then there are ways for us to say God is in a classical way, and there's also a way for us to say God is in a neoclassical way, without saying that these things they are the be it and end all of what God is. And so I just felt that there was an intuitive understanding of how to bring these things together. And then when I started looking into Lewis's work and sort of this idea of modal realism, and specifically ontological pluralism, which we might be able to cover in some way.
I hope so, man.
I felt that there was a way for us to square the circle and bring these two things together. So it's like the way that I was saying to you in my research, I have an idea of something, and that a moment in time I might not have the solution, but then when I'm reading something else, so I park that over and I say, let me go and read something else, maybe deal with another issue I wanted to deal with, and then I stumble upon the philosophy of something there, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that actually fits perfectly with the prior issue that I left over there. And so that's sort of how it worked with this. But I just felt for a few years that there was a way to sort of bring these together in a coherent package. And I felt sort of Lewis and his metaphysics and things related to that allow us to sort of do that.
Yeah. Well, and so I think one cool thing, there's a lot of cool things about you, and we talked about that before. Well, one of the cool things about you is you're kind of like a David Lewis, in that you're a world builder. You want to have a systematic picture of the world. And I think for some people it's like, dude, how does this guy keep coming out with so many papers? But it is something you've been thinking about for a while, and so it has all these different implications. So we talked about like monarchical Trinitarianism before, and people are like, well, this dude's a Unitarian. It's like, well, no, he actually holds to like a social model of the Trinity. So it's exactly diametrically opposed. What are you talking about? But then you're like, yeah, but I want to hold the simplicity. And you're like, well, how do you do that? And you're like, well, we gotta have different existential quantifiers then. And so it's just cool how you've got this picture, and I don't think we've seen the full thing yet. But maybe when you come out with your ST, man, like it'll be this complete. But we keep getting these pictures into your project, and it's an awesome project, man.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm sort of trying to, within a year, 2 years, bring this together in sort of a monograph.
Okay.
Just how to, because I've got in my head like how to, I'm trying to systematically bring things together. And yes, I'm hoping some point in time I can put that in some monograph, which I'm sort of trying to write, which can just sort of make it seem like it's actually fits together in some sort of neat package. But I think this systematic sort of thinking is just because I'm hooked on Swinburne. So Swinburne is like, for me, the guy who's really sort of done that at a really good level, just being able to paint a picture of how, we can take the best philosophy out there, and we don't have to be scared of philosophy, as some people are in sort of a theological circle. We can take the best philosophy, we can utilize the tools and techniques of this and bring it together to form a systematic whole, which fits with the Christian worldview. And that's sort of the path I'm trying to follow in some ways, stumbling along. But yeah, that's sort of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. Well, so I always assume that people have seen the last episode and stuff, and many probably haven't. So can you just say a bit about yourself? So
Yes.
are you firstly a theologian? Are you a philosophical theologian, analytic theologian? Are you a philosopher? Like what? How do you think of yourself in that way?
Yeah, so I think I would go more with the philosopher of religion sort of thing.
Okay.
So philosopher of religion, philosophical theologian. I think it's more when you have that sort of two terms, philosophical theologian. I think I emphasize more the philosophical aspect
Sure.
than the theological aspect. But I mean, I would say that qualifying it, saying that my philosophy is always guided by the underlying theology that I affirm and that I hold to.
Yeah.
But I think I'm very that sort of philosophy first guy. So again, going back to Swinburne, it's that same sort of attitude of let's sort of sort out the philosophy aspect,
Right.
and then we try our best to make sense of that within the theological worldview that we're affirming. But I think it's more. I would affirm. I would I'll probably assent more to the philosopher tag than the theological tag. In that I do need to improve my biblical theology. I think that will help. That will help me. Yeah.
Yeah. So no one ever says they're a theological philosopher. I don't even know what that would really entail, but maybe I'll go with
Yeah.
that route, and I'll say I'm the first theological philosopher.
Yeah.
So okay, dude. So in jumping into this paper, I want to set things
Yes.
off. You have classical theism and you have neoclassical theism.
Yeah.
Classical theism is pretty easy, I think, for most people to understand. It's the classic doctrines. Uh, the omnis, God is omnicompetent, plus simplicity, immutability. What else am I missing?
So you have simplicity, imparsibility, immutability, and like timelessness. So I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
sort of
timelessness.
the
Yeah,
package you sort of get. Yeah.
yeah. So then, so neoclassical theism is one that people aren't going to know as much, but it's
Yes.
just like the converse of that or
Yeah.
inverse,
Yeah.
whatever. Converse. Can you just lay out? What?
Yes. Yeah. So it's sort of just the polar opposite sort of attributes. So we classical theists and neoclassical theists, they affirm theism in that you can see that sort of in their name. So they affirm that there is a God who, exactly as you were saying, is perfect, has all the omni characteristics, and he's basically the fundamental entity. He's at the rock bottom of reality. That's what God is. And then you have these sort of extended attributes that they ascribe to God. So the classical attributes and package would be exactly as you said: simplicity, imparsibility, immutability, and timelessness. And then neoclassical theism, which is sort of this sort of newer movement. There is sort of historical sort of grounding for it, some theologians would say, but it's just taking the opposite of those four attributes. So I don't think they'll use a term instead of simplicity, saying that God is complex. I don't think they'll use that term.
Yeah,
But I
some
think
do,
it's
but yeah,
I mean, they would say it's simple, but they would affirm some form of complexity. So I just say
yeah.
God is complex.
Sometimes they do it to trigger the classical guys. Like, no, God's
Yes,
complex. You're like, dude, stop. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
So let's say complexity. So God is complex. He's temporal. He's mutable, and he's parsable. But that would be, I mean, you'll qualify those terms. So when we say God is complex, when someone's a neoclassical theist, they would affirm some form of simplicity, but it will be a weaker form of simplicity.
Mhm.
So normally that would be that they would ascribe attributes to God, but those attributes would be properties. So God instantiates or he exemplifies certain sets of properties.
Mhm.
And the relation, so as I was just saying, the relation between God and his properties is one of instantiation or exemplification. It's not numerical identity.
Mhm.
So someone who affirms simplicity would say God is his power, his knowledge, his goodness. Someone who affirms God being complex, a neoclassical theist, would say that God exemplifies these things. He's
Yeah,
not those things. So so he has properties, but then also he's temporal. So I sort of go with Ryan Mullins's sort of way of interpreting this. So things like God doesn't have temporal extension. Sorry,
Mhm.
God has temporal extension. He has some form of temporal location, and he sort of endures through time.
Yeah,
So there is a way of basically saying that God is everlastingly enduring through time.
yeah,
Someone who affirms timelessness would say that God is not going through time in that sort of way. And then you have mutability, but the mutability would be saying that God is able to change let's say, extrinsically. So God can experience some form of extrinsic change. He might be able to also have some form of intrinsic change, but they will always affirm that he doesn't change in his essential attributes, given that they are essential.
Like
So
moral
essential
perfection, like he's
yeah,
not going
exactly,
from morally perfect to morally imperfect.
Yes, yeah. So he
Yeah.
wouldn't change in any of his essential properties. So he's mutable, he's changeable in some sense, but he's unchangeable in another sense of the word. And then partible would be something like he's able to be causally affected. So that will normally entail that he can experience some emotional states.
Yeah.
So God can experience anger or wrath or happiness or all those sort of emotional states. So it's basically just trying to say that God he's perfect, but in a way I mean the way Swinburne would go, because I think he's sort of the paradigm example of someone who's affirming a neoclassical view, would be God is a maximal or perfect person. I mean, even though neoclassical theists would say they don't hold to the term, let's say, theistic personalism, which they'll see sort of as a derogative term. But I think they would affirm the idea that God is a person, but all of the attributes that he has are limitless. And so what we understand of personhood for us, God exemplifies that, but he would have them without any limitations.
Right.
And then obviously a classical theist would not hold to that view. They will disaffirm that, given his simplicity, his timelessness, his immutability, and his impassibility.
Yeah.
So they seem to be polar opposites. That's what we sort of have with these conceptions.
Yeah, totally. One thing just for the neoclassical theists, when they are looking to affirm a weaker form of simplicity, you point out that often you'll go to essential attributes like omnipotence, and then derive the rest of the omnis or the rest of the properties from that. I thought that's a pretty good move. I like that move.
It's a really, really good, and I think that's sort of the main person again who does that is Swinburne. So Swinburne used to, in his earlier works, he would derive all of the other attributes from God being omnipotent, him being omniscient, and him being perfectly free. So from those three attributes, you then get perfect goodness, you then get everlastingness, you then get some form of necessity. So all of the attributes stem from that. But then in his most recent edition of The Coherence of Theism, which came out in 2016, he basically reduced that to just the property of omnipotence. So he believes you can get all of the attributes of God from God just exemplifying the one attributes of omnipotence. And so he believes that. So they would say maybe the way, instead of simplicity being importance, it's unity. So God is the most unified being, specifically because he exemplifies only one property, which then entails all the other properties. So they all fit together in sort of a harmonious whole.
Yeah, and it's pretty fun to think like, well, how does omniscience? How is that entailed by omnipotence? It's like, well, if God is all powerful, then he'd have to know about all this stuff, and you can do it, and Swinburne does it because he's a genius. And then you just go, look, the divine nature is unified, and each person of the Trinity, has the divine nature in some sense, right? So then there's your kind of unity in Trinity. Which is fun. Coherence of Theism. That's like a must read, but it's also like a tough read. Which is wild.
It's not bedtime read. Oh, it depends if you need a good sleep aid. But it is good. It's awesome work.
So so you have this dilemma, which it can be motivated or not motivated depending on your tradition and stuff like that, but you call it the Theism Dilemma. And so it's if you're a traditionalist, if you're from a denomination, Christian denomination like Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, Presbyterian, maybe Reformed Baptist, you've got the great tradition, and then you've got Scripture, and the neoclassical guys go to Scripture and says, look, dude, it looks like God can change his mind. It looks like God is more personal than the classical guys want. But then you have the tradition, and you're saying like, well, the tradition is classical theism, and maybe you can try and find wiggle room in one way or the other, but apparently these two look contradictory. You want to fill out the Theism Dilemma any more than that?
Exactly. So I was basically trying to, in the paper, I was trying to emphasize a dilemma which I believe is sort of playing in my mind, saying, well, because I'm Roman Catholic myself, and so I'm sort of caught in this dilemma because I'm convert to Roman Catholicism, so I've got all of the Protestant sort of thoughts and all those sort of things and background, and so you have a high view of Scripture, as also Roman Catholics do, but you have a real high view of Scripture as a Protestant, as sort of, let's say, the sole authority. And so your theology is determined by what it says in Scripture. And so Scripture, according to loads of scholars on the matter, paints a picture which seems to fit with the neoclassical view of God.
Mm-hmm.
God seems to be one who's in time in the way that we are in time, but he's everlastingly existing through time. God seems to be someone who goes, through certain emotional states, and so he seems to be passable in a certain way. He seems to be mutable in some sort of sense because he changes in certain ways. Maybe he changes his mind or he changes his emotional states. And so Scripture seems to paint a picture of God that fits very well with the neoclassical view.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't seem to fit well with the classical view. Now, you will have some classical theists who will interpret certain passages in certain ways, but that would be always within a certain philosophical framework,
Mm-hmm.
and some sort of lens will have to be placed over to have that interpretation. But if we were just to go with our, let's say, best hermeneutical strategies and exegetical strategies, most scholars will say, well, it seems to be that it fits very well with the neoclassical view.
Right.
So people like John Peckham have done great work in sort of showing that sort of idea that neoclassical view seems to be the view that we find in Scripture. But then again, as if you're a traditionalist, someone who's a Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, you want to affirm the authority of Scripture. You want to affirm what Scripture tells us about God. But then we also have another form of authority, which is tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And tradition is quite clear on the matter until quite recently had a classical view of God. And so if you, let's say, have certain doctors of the church who play a part in forming some form of tradition. So you have Augustine, you have Aquinas, you have, Anselm, the 3 A's, the 18.
Right.
Well, you have all of them. And they seem to be people who are affirming a classical view of God, a God who's timeless, a God who's impassible and immutable and simple. And so if we are affirming tradition, which a traditionalist would want to do and would have to do, it seems to me that we have another concept of God that we have to affirm. And so it seems like we're pulled in two directions. One neoclassical view that we find in the authority that's given to us by Scripture, and one classical view which is given to us by the authority that we find in tradition. And so there seems to be a dilemma. I have to have both of these sort of sources of authority. I have to affirm both of them, but I don't seem to be able to do that without falling into a contradiction, given the concepts of God that we find in each of these sources. And so the dilemma is there for someone who affirms both sources of authority. Yeah. But if you're someone who doesn't and just, let's say, just says Scripture and we don't need tradition, then you don't have the dilemma.
Right.
But a lot of people will want to affirm tradition in some way.
Yeah. And there's different ways out, but apparently it's contradictory. And I wanted to mention that even Reformed Baptists have this problem. Presbyterians and Anglicans. If you're reading Turretin, if you're reading Bavinck, whatever, like you're going to have these problems as well. So it's not just Roman Catholics, not just Eastern Orthodox. It's not like, well, that's their problem. Like, no, this is a problem for all of us who want to be historical at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So it's anyone who wants to affirm tradition and the authority of these things. And I think a lot of confessional sort of Protestants and Reformed individuals would want to in some form. Right. It seems to be a lot of people are caught in this dilemma. But I would qualify, as you were saying, there are ways out of this, and obviously loads of people will. But let's say we want to take this at face value. Mm-hmm. It seems to be like you have this dilemma. And is there a way out? And that's sort of what I'm trying to investigate.
Well, and Josh, what I'm pumped about is so someone like James Anderson might go with warranted mystery. Oliver Crisp would do this as well, and they might go the epistemological route and say, I don't think this is a real contradiction, but it could be for us because we're limited and finite. And so they go the epistemological route, which is cool. I like that. They've both been on to talk about that. But you're going the metaphysical route, and you're saying, here's how we're explaining why it's not a contradiction. Yes. And it gets pretty wild, dude. I'm really excited to keep going in. It's pretty wild. But just before we do that, you brought up Ryan Mullen's creation objection to help motivate further. Yes. Do you want to lay that out for us? If not, I got the premises.
Exactly. So Ryan in great a great chapter in the actually it's left my mind, but the handbook on analytic theology might be the TNT one. So in this article, he sort of laid out this issue. and he was saying that there seems to be good reason to be a neoclassical theist, given this what's sort of termed the creation objection. So it's the idea that God, we want to affirm that God is a creator of all reality. We want to affirm that he's the one who brought into existence everything that exists, or everything that has the ability to be brought into existence. God has to be the source of that. But the problem that you have as a classical theist is that if God is the creator of, let's say, contingent reality, then it seems to be the case that God has to bear a relation to contingent reality. But if God bears a relation to contingent reality, and that's just to emphasize the point, God at one point wasn't bearing this relation, and then he began to bear this relation. And so if God then began to bear a relation to the reality that he brought into existence, it seems to be the case that you have to drop some of the attributes of God. Let's say, for example, his immutability. Because God at one point was without creation, and then another point was with creation, you seem to be in sort of you have a problem, because God then entered into a relation with creation the moment that he brought into existence. But classical theists want to affirm the idea that God doesn't bear any real relation to creation. Now, real relation doesn't necessarily mean that God doesn't have any form of relation to creation. But the relation that we want to affirm is not one in which God is causally affected in any way, or God can change in his states in any way. And so what you have is a classical theist is affirming that God doesn't bear any real relation to creation, and God doesn't begin to be related to anything. But what we seem to be wanting to affirm is that God is the creator of everything. And so if God is the creator of everything, it seems to be the case that he did begin to be related to creation at one point in time, and that he bears a real relation to creation. And so we seem to be, again, caught in this sort of dilemma. We affirm the creative sort of sovereignty of God, then we can't really hold to a classical theist view that says God is immutable. And so there seems to be a tension here.
Yeah, I love this one, and I think Ryan and I have talked about this one as well on the podcast. So go back and check those ones out. I think probably Did God Invent Time? I think we talked about it in that one. But yeah, it's and Jordan Stefaniak just came on to talk about God's relation to the world and how a classical theist might affirm that. And then Joe Schmidt come on and destroy all that. And so this is a real problem. It's a live option. There are live options, but again, like taking this at face value seems really difficult. And then now we're going to get into the metaphysics, and it's wild. So everyone strap in. So Josh, you say that we can get out of these two dilemmas, and whatever else you can multiply dilemmas. And I'm sure Joe Schmidt is doing that as we speak, but you can get out of this through ontological pluralism and modal realism. And it's wild. So let's talk about ontological pluralism first.
Okay. So ontological pluralism is a very interesting view. And it's a lot of philosophers who've worked on the matter have said there is historical precedent to the view, but it's something that fell out of favor really until Chris McDaniel's paper. So Chris McDaniel, big philosopher working at the moment at Notre Dame, how do you pronounce it?
We say Dame over here. We're American.
Dame,
American
sorry, Dame.
Swine.
I've got to pronounce things better. So Notre Dame. So he's working there, and he wrote a paper in 2009 called, if I'm correct, Ways of Being. And so he tried to sort of reintroduce this idea that there are different ways of existing. So normally we assume what's called an ontological monist view, the idea that there's only one way of being. Whatever exists in the same way. So the table in front of me, myself, a dog, a cat, and even numbers, if they exist, they all exist in the same way. But then Chris McDaniel and another individual called Jason Turner, they tried to sort of reinvigorate this idea that we have multiple ways of existing. And so things that fall into different ontological categories have different ways of existing. So the way to sort of start understanding that is through, normally the example that's brought up are abstract objects and concrete objects. So it's difficult to define those terms, but generally through examples, we can sort of understand it. So abstract objects like numbers and concrete objects like tables. These things exist in different ways. And so why they exist in different ways is because they fall into these different categories. Numbers fall into the category of abstractor, and tables fall into the category of concreter. And so because they fall into these different ontological categories, they are part of different ontological structures.
Mhm.
So reality is structured, but it's not structured in the same way. Things that fall into different categories fall into different structures of reality. And so because these things exist in different categories and structures, they all exist in different ways.
Yeah.
So they have one way of being. So numbers have an abstract way of existing. And concrete objects like tables exist in a concrete way of existing, a concrete way of being. And so a way of being is just sort of this idea, emphasizing the idea that because these things exist in different ontological structures, they exist in different ways.
Yeah.
And sorry, just to emphasize this point, I think Jason Turner has a really good sort of example. I sort of bring this out in the paper with, and I try and not good at illustrating things, but I tried to illustrate in the paper where he sort of used the example of a pegboard.
Yeah, I love the pegboard. This is helpful.
Yeah. So the ontological monist, so which is sort of the general idea at the moment in philosophy that we all have one way of being, one structure of reality, they would believe that there's one pegboard. And so let's say we have this board and then we have different pegs on the board. And so these different pegs might have some rubber bands that are around these pegs, which are just basically properties. So you have, let's say, the table, which is one peg. You have a human, which is another peg. You have a number. You have a letter. You have all of these sort of things. And abstractor and concreter all exist in the same pegboard. So the pegs exist all on the same board. But an ontological pluralist would say, no, that's it. That's the wrong way of visualizing reality. Mm-hmm. Reality is in such a way that we have different pegboards for different types of objects. And so abstract objects will go on one pegboard and concrete objects will go on another pegboard. Yeah. And so these pegboards are not overlapping, even though they can overlap, but generally they don't. Yeah. And so these things, because they exist in these different pegboards, they exist in different ways. We can't say they exist univocally in the same way.
Yeah. So real quick. So do we bring the rubber bands back in on ontological pluralism? Like what work is the rubber band doing in the?
Yeah. So it's just the idea of properties. So if you have a peg, when I was visualizing in the paper, I didn't have any rubber bands on the abstractor. Yeah. Let's say because they're not instantiating or exemplifying any properties. But on the concrete board, you'll have, let's say, one rubber band which is on a peg, which is the property of color or something. Yeah. Or certain properties of weights. So yeah, the bands are just basically properties. And let's say if they are attached they're sort of stretched together and they're looping over both pegs, that might be a relation. So I'm related to, in some way, let's say I bear the father relation to another concrete object, which is my daughter or something. So yeah, the bands are just playing the roles of properties. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's really helpful because I think some people will jump on that. So there's this pegboard, the abstract pegboard. Let's say there's a blue peg, and this is going to mess up universals because the universal blue is not blue itself. Okay, we all know that. Yeah. So let's color this fatherhood peg in the abstract blue, and then the rubber band would encompass all the pegs that bear a father relation. It's like that.
Yeah, it could be that, but it might be the individual peg might have the rubber band stretched to a specific individual peg. So gotcha. I have my daughter,
because that's a relation.
Myself, and then the rubber band will be attached, and that might be the father relation or something.
Yeah, that. That's good.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Well, okay. So with that, so we have ways of being. You talk about elite quantifiers, but so generic existence, like I think you still have room for that, right? Like there's still there's still a univocal, all things that exist still in the univocal sense that they still all have existence, right?
Exactly. Yes. So this is a very important move that needs to be emphasized because there was a very very well-written paper by Trenton Merrick's,
Mm.
where he argues, basically saying that there's a problem with ontological pluralism, given this idea of generic existence. Now, generic existence is just the idea that all entities that exist fall into a univocal category of existence. And so there's a general quantifier. There's a quantifier that applies to all of these entities that fall within this category. So abstractor will have the quantifier, and that same quantifier will be utilized for myself, given that we both exist. But yeah, the problem that Merrick is trying to raise was this idea of there needs to be an affirmation of generic existence. And it gets very difficult, his paper, but it's just basically the idea that there needs to be an affirmation of generic existence. Now, he was saying ontological pluralists don't do this. They don't affirm generic existence. And so you have an issue that can be raised against them. And the objection that you raised, I am persuaded by it. But what's interesting is that McDaniel and Turner's view has room for generic existence. Because what they're trying to say is that, let's say we have these quantifiers. So we have elite quantifiers, and I think it'll be helpful to sort of try and understand what these are now. So you have these quantifiers, and these elite quantifiers are just quantifiers that firstly are semantically primitive. So they're not reducible to something else linguistically, but they also are natural. Now, people might be saying, what's going on? Natural? What do you mean by that? Now, natural stems from the term or notion natural stems from the work of David Lewis. And basically, it's just basically trying to say that the vocabulary that we're using, or the quantifiers that we're using, they need to capture things that carve nature at its joints. They need to speak about fundamental things. These quantifiers need to quantify over the most fundamental things in reality. And so elite quantifiers pick out things which are more fundamental. And so what we're trying to say then is that everything falls into this category of generic existence and has a generic quantifier that is applicable to them. However, there are also, because there are different structures of reality, there is a more fine-grained quantifier which is applicable to each thing that falls into that specific domain of reality. So there are certain quantifiers that range over the abstract domain of reality, and there's certain more fine-grained quantifiers that quantify, or they range over the domain of concrete objects. So it's the idea of fine-grainedness. If you want to have a more fine-grained ontology, you can't just have the generic quantifier that applies to everything that exists, which it is applicable to everything. But we can also have these more fine-grained quantifiers that sort of carve nature a little bit more finely, with abstractor and with concreter and other things that are fundamental in that sense.
Yeah, I really like this one too, because you have. I know that like Meinongianism is bad, and you don't want to be a Meinongian. You don't want to say that there's multiple. So when you say ontological pluralism, it's like, well, that sounds like Meinong, and didn't Quine like totally refute him? But here it's like, no, the existential quantifier, this way, that's got this like range, and you can parse that in different ways, and it's actually natural to do so because we do it all the time. When we say something's abstract, we say it's concrete, so it's not making up some category. It's actually just trying to do justice to the language that we already use.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it.
That's good. I like that. I don't know much about like Meinong, whatever. Is that still? I don't know if Merrick's like raised that charge against ontological pluralists, but do you have any kind of concern that this is like Meinongianism? Is that even on the radar, or who cares?
Yeah, I don't think so, because it's just I think you captured it perfectly. It's just trying to capture our ordinary usage of language, because we don't use language in the way that there is just one, there is this quantifier that applies to everything, univocally. We affirm that there is a quantifier that we all fall into, but when we speak with more fine-grained speech. So we do speak in a way like, are there any numbers here? I mean, when I'm saying, are there any numbers here? What I'm really quantifying over in my speech is concrete objects. Because if you said to someone, can you see a number here?
Right.
They're going to say no.
It's not that kind of
unless
thing.
it's on the wall or something's written out. But you're not going to be able to say that, because what you're doing, you're quantifying in a specific way in a more fine-grained way, because you are quantifying just over concreta.
Yeah.
Even though, let's say you affirm, let's say some Platonism or something, where there are these abstract objects, there are numbers existing, but I'm not quantifying in that way in my speech.
Right.
And so what this is trying to do is trying to actually say there is a ontological basis for this, because there are different structures of reality. And so these quantifiers allow us to capture those reality in the best way possible.
Yeah. I like it, man. Again, it's scary because it's new, but it's really cool, and I'm excited to see, for everyone else to see as well, the work you're about to do with that. So we have these different existential quantifiers, which are more fine grained than just the standard existential quantifier. And you have, I don't know how to refer to that existential quantifier, like backwards EA, and then you have, like backwards EC. Can you explain those for us?
Yeah, it's just having sort of the subscript thing. So yeah, it's weird. It's difficult. It's easy writing it, but probably explaining it is not so easy. But it's just saying, something exists in a concrete way, something exists in a abstract way. So you don't just say something exists. If you say something exists, you're just talking in the generic context with that sort of backwardsy generic quantifier. But when we're saying something exists in a concrete way, we're saying this thing exists, but it exists in a way that concrete objects exist. And this thing exists, let's say an abstract object, but exists in an abstract way because it exists in the way that abstract objects exist within their framework and structure of reality. So it's just basically using Ways talk. That's probably the easiest way. But it's easier to write than it is probably to communicate in speech.
Well, so I pulled a Cameron Bertuzzi, and I don't know if we can see that, but are you able to see it? I can't see right now.
No.
Okay, cool. So then you can see, like, there's the existential quantifier, which is backwards E for the folks. Sorry if you're listening, this is no good, but if you're watching on YouTube, and then that can be parsed or that can be carved at its joints more aptly by saying, look, there's these two different ways. One's a concrete, and I think it's good because it does help us with everyday language. Someone says, like, do you think the number 2 exists? I'm like, yeah, I do. And like, this book exists, dude. Like, where's the number 2? And you're like, well, I don't think it exists in that way. It exists as a concrete. I'm a Platonist myself, so I think it exists. But depending on how you parse that, you're going to parse it in different ways. But we do this all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. So we got that. So that's kind of some tools that's going to help us. But now we got, unless you got anything else to say, theistic ontological pluralism.
Yes. No. I can move on to that. So utilizing this metaphysics, so utilizing this view of reality where there are different structures, different frameworks of reality, and things existing different ways corresponding to their structures and frameworks. We can apply this, I think, to deal with the theism dilemma, because a theist, as I was saying, is sort of pulled in two ways. So traditionalist who affirms theism wants to say that God is existing as a simple, immutable, impassible, and timeless entity. But he's I
got some graphs for us here,
or
figures I pulled from your paper. So if you're listening, sorry, but
hopefully it's clear. So we have these two concepts of God, and so what you have sort of in that sort of, if it's coming across in the left image with the multiple sort of arrows, you have this idea of God having all of these attributes, but these attributes are not identical to him, and so he bears an instantiation relation to them. Sorry, that's actually the right one. So the right one is, he has all of these attributes, and these attributes are all part of him. So I was trying to say, in a way, they're all sort of, parts of him, even though a neoclassical theist won't say maybe it's a part, but they are all composing God because they're not identical to him. And so the one with the arrows, is the one where we have identity relations. So each of the properties that God has, he has them, and he has them in a way that is identical to them, given his simplicity. So we're sort of pulled with these two conceptions. We have these two conceptions in front of us, and we have sources of authority that says, in a way, that we seem to have to, at a prima facie level, have to affirm these two concepts. But that leads to contradiction, given that they are basically just polar opposites and contraries of each other. And so the way that I was trying to put forward in the paper that we can square the circle and try and affirm both of these sort of polar opposite concepts of God is by assuming this view of ontological pluralism. So there's this idea, as we were saying, that there are different structures of reality. So let's go with the abstract structure of reality, and we have the concrete structure of reality. And so these structures of reality are distinct, and these structures of reality have different ways of being that correspond to them. So abstract objects exist in one way, and concrete objects exist in a distinct way. Now, God, the way that I sort of see this is that I place God within both structures of reality.
Mm-hmm.
So God exists in the abstract way, sort of in the abstract structure, and he has an abstract way of existing. And then God exists in the concrete structure, and he has the concrete way of existing. Mm-hmm. So exactly as it says sort of in the image there, God is the entity who's perfect. He's the ultimate source of reality. And so he has, in one way of existing, which we can call his abstract way of existing, he's a simple, timeless, and immutable and impassable being. And then in his concrete way of existing, he's a complex, temporal, mutable, and passable entity. Now, how this deals with the contradiction is given the elite quantifiers that are in play here. If we just had the generic quantifier that's applied univocally, we will have a problem, because we will say God exists, and he exists as a simple and complex being. He exists as a timeless and temporal being, mutable and immutable, impassable and passable, and that would be contradictory. But if we have different ways of being, which are expressed by different elite quantifiers, then we don't have a contradiction there, because we can relativize each of the attributes to the distinct ways of being. So we're not saying that God in his abstract way of being is simple and complex. We're saying he's solely simple in this way of being. Yeah. He's solely timeless and immutable and impassable in this distinct way of being. But then in his concrete way of being, which is a distinct way of being from the abstract one, he is complex, mutable, passable, and temporal. And so these quantifiers allow us to deal with this problem, because we relativize to each way of being. Mm-hmm. So what we then have is that we don't have a contradiction anymore, because we're not affirming and disaffirming the same thing. We're affirming one thing in one way, and we're affirming another thing in another way. And so the contradiction there is not to be had.
Yeah. And again, this is an old move called the qua move from the medievals, and it's just qua, and it's used in terms of cashing out the different natures of the two natures of Christ. Qua his divine nature, he's got, he's omnipotent, but qua his human nature, he's not. And so it's not like this tactic is wrong or brand new or anything like that, but it's new in that it's referring to, it's trying to synthesize two different models or extensions of God.
Yeah.
And so how might we like motivate this, right? So it's not like it's a bad move or anything like that.
Yeah.
Again, dude, I like it, but people at home might say like, that's great, and it works for Christ because it makes sense there. So now we need to motivate it in our models of God.
Yes. Yeah. So I mean, first, because I sort of bring this up in a footnote, saying, because I think when it comes to theology, the new is not good. You want to hold to the old and affirm it in some way. And so when you have this sort of new sort of, ontology in play, and we're applying it, people say, but was this thought of before? But what I was trying to bring on the footnote is, you have this exact thing happening, and it was affirmed throughout church history, and by ecumenical councils when it was applied to the context of Christ. Yeah. And so the method itself has historical precedent. And so my idea then is just saying, well, why can't we apply this in a different context and deal with a problem, which is a problem? And so what we have is, yes, this relativization, this qua sort of move is just in play here. But it's not an ad hoc move, given that we are affirming, a ready-made ontology here, which is this idea that there are different ways of being. And so we're just saying, well, God falls into these different structures. And so given that he falls into these different structures, we can then relativize the attributes to each structure and way of being. But the main idea is to affirm the method itself of relativizing things is there. It's just trying to use it in a different context, and maybe with a different sort of ontological framework behind it. But it's there in some way.
Yeah. So like guys like Paul Helm have charged some people who have done similar things with they're process theologians, because they have God changing and God not changing. And one way that I found to motivate this, because I actually really like this, is to use an authorial analogy, and it's kind of a continental way. So Sorry for all the analytic, but it's saying like we can motivate this qua move not just with Christ but with God if we say that God is like an author of creation in that he wrote himself into the story, and qua the story he has real relations. He's a character. He's the main character, so he relates to everyone. But qua the God, the author who stands outside of the story, man, he doesn't have the same relation to the characters that he does inside the story. And this doesn't have to be like this is Gnosticism. We don't know anything about God, insofar as God represents himself truly for who he really is as a character within the story, which he has to do because he's God.
Yeah.
And so that's one way that I found. And so I really like your approach, man, because I think it actually does all the metaphysical work of the continental just slapping on of the ethereal analogy. So I want to flesh it out more because I think that I think you're motivating this through Lewis's modal realism, right?
Exactly, yeah. So I sort of, in that section of the paper where I say, well, it seems to be, we can go home now, the contradiction is not there. But then someone could just raise the objection and say, well, why would we take God to be an abstract object? So, I mean, it seems to be clear that throughout church history, we've affirmed the concreteness of God.
Yeah.
We don't really, take God to be abstract. And so is it the case that he actually has an abstract way of being that allows us to relativize the attributes in those ways? Right. And so I'll say, yeah, okay, that seems to be a fair objection. And so there needs to be reasoning to sort of allow God to fall into the distinct structures of reality. And so the way I do that is by then sort of changing tack and going on to a different sort of metaphysical view, which is modal realism. So if you want me to unpack that now,
yeah, please, dude.
Yeah. So you have this sort of really interesting view from Lewis, as I was saying before, giant within contemporary philosophy, and sort of notorious and infamous for this idea of modal realism. This is the thing that sort of stuck with him. And so it's sort of taking a step back. We have this, this view of modality, this idea of modality, this field of modality, where we're studying about, modal terms like possibility and necessity. And, a lot of philosophers are trying to understand, well, what is the metaphysics behind our language use? Or I think a better way to sort of go with it is sort of truth maker idea. So we have all of these modal statements. So it's possible that I could have been, a lawyer, or it's possible that I could have been, a physician, or I could have been a football player, or I could have been a basketball player. It's possible. It seems to be the case that these things could have taken place. Or it's possible that, Hitler could have won World War II. So, great sort of TV show. Oh my gosh, it just left
Man
my
in
mind.
the High Castle.
Man in the High Castle. Man in the High Castle.
Not as good as the book, but yeah.
Yeah, I've never read the book, which I need to.
Yeah.
I'm hooked on TV shows too much. But yeah, so that's a great sort of view where Hitler could have won. It's possible that he could have won it. And so we have all of these possibility terms, and we have terms of necessity, like it's necessary that if you assume something like origin essentialism, it's necessary that my parents are my parents. Or it's necessary that if I'm a human, I'm a rational animal, or something like that. So we have all of these.
That's metaphysical necessity, right? Or we don't care about the necessity involved here.
Yeah, I'm not so fussed.
Okay.
About it. Yeah,
cool.
Get sort of I don't want to bore people too much. Already. So it just seems to be the case that I am these things and I must be these things.
Yeah.
And it's possible that I could have been these things. So we have all of these modal terms. Now, a lot of philosophers, specifically sort of in the 70s, 80s, 90s, were trying to say, well, what's the truth maker of these terms? What makes it the case that it's possible that I could have been these things? And, some philosophers said, let's get deep into the metaphysics. So you have this field of modal metaphysics where they try and say, what are these truth makers for these propositional terms, for these statements that I could have been something? And so a lot of, there was a big push sort of in the 80s and 90s for sort of possible world semantics. So the truth maker, or the modal structure behind these modal statements, are possible worlds. And so it's true that I could have, been a lawyer, because in some possible world, I am a lawyer. Or it's true that I could have been, or Hitler could have won World War II, because in some possible world, he did win World War II. And so what they've done is that they're utilizing this terminology of possible worlds to help, serve as truth makers for these statements. Why it's true is because it's true in these possible worlds. And so then what happened really is that there was then a divide between so Peter van Inwagen sort of termed them, you have concretists and you have abstractionists. So you have a divide in the way to understand the reality of these worlds. So abstractionists, people like Alvin Plantinga, would take all of these possible worlds to be abstract objects,
like states of affairs for planning, all right?
Yeah. So he would define them as states of affairs, but states of affairs, they're these abstracta. So they're abstract objects, but he would define them as states of affairs. Or you'll have Robert Adams, who will take possible world to be propositions and things like that. So there are these abstract objects, and they don't exist in concrete ways, but they are the things that we can identify as possible worlds, which then serve as truth makers. But then you have the lone wolf of David Lewis. I think he is honestly a lone wolf in this. So you have people that I bring out in the paper later to sort of develop it. But the whole package of concretism is found in the work of David Lewis, who believed that the best way to understand the nature of these possible worlds that serve as truth makers for these modal statements is that these worlds are actually concrete objects. And what he means, even though he struggled to sort of understand, the distinction between abstract and concrete objects, because it is difficult to understand what these mean. But the way to understand it is the way that we see our world, every other possible world that exists is like our world.
Yeah, I got a slide. This might help. I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah. So that's good, actually, because I can take a step back. So in his ontology, there is something called the pluriverse, which is just basically the totality of reality. And what makes up the totality of reality are all these concrete possible worlds. So we have this totality of reality that has all of these concrete worlds. And these worlds are not states of affairs. They're not propositions. They're not abstract objects, but they are concrete objects in the way that our universe is physical. That's how all of these worlds are. So the world in which, Hitler won World War II, that's a real world, and it's concrete in the same way that this existence is concrete. And so they're not abstract objects, but they exist in some way. But the key thing about these worlds is that they're spatiotemporal like ours, but they are isolated. So they cannot be causally linked in any way. So the existence that we have, our possible world, which is one of the infinite plurality of worlds, so that's why it's called the pluriverse, infinite plurality of different worlds, our world cannot be connected to any other world. So we cannot go, it's not like a multiverse, which sometimes there's a misconception. It's not the multiverse because there's causal links between our universe and the other universe that makes the multiverse. But it's the idea that within the pluriverse, so that image there, each world is isolated, and so they are not in any way connected.
So I just had Barry Lamb on to talk about this, and he said, if there was a multiverse in the way that Marvel pitches it, where there is connection, that would be in its own universe in the Lewisian sense, and then there'd be, because it has to be isolated. So even it'd be multiverses within a universe within the pluriverse.
Yes, exactly. So that multiverse would just make up one possible world.
Yeah, right.
So every possible world is just simply the totality of spatio-temporal reality that we have, which could be a universe or it could be a multiverse.
Right.
But that multiverse will just compose one of those possible worlds. So in that image, it will just be P1, it'll be world 1 or P1, and then you have world 2 or P2, which is just another possible world. But that world is not connected in any ways to us. So we have all of these possible worlds, but something very important to understand as well is that he had different ontological categories. So the image might be brought out, hopefully people can understand it, but basically he had 3 ontological categories. So everything that can exist and does exist falls into one of these categories, or maybe even more than one, as I bring out later. So he had the category of possible individuals, he had the category of impossible individuals, and he had the category of non-individuals. Possible individuals are all of the possible worlds. So all the possible worlds fall into that ontological category. Everything that inhabits those possible worlds, like us, like tables, like pebbles, they all fall into the category of possible individuals. Then impossible individuals, as I tried to bring out in that sort of image there, which says IPI, is basically an impossible individual is like a mereological sum of different worlds.
Yeah.
Even though they're not sort of causally related, there's a way of these impossible individuals sort of being joined together.
Yeah.
But again, emphasizing impossible individuals, he didn't really affirm as such the reality of these things, but there's maybe some room for that.
So I don't know, does this one help anymore or no? It's the overlap.
The development later, yeah. So it's still that one. So you have, as you can see, all of the worlds, world 1, world 2, in that sort of concrete box. Those are all of the possible individuals. PI, you can see all those worlds. They will all fall into the possible individual category. And then that sort of oval that goes around 2 of the possible worlds each, you'll have the impossible individuals, because it's just saying there's a mereological sum of all of these possible worlds. But that category is not very important. It's the first category of possible individuals, concrete worlds. And then for the paper, it's the third category. So he had the category of non-individuals, which is sort of that weird box that I have, that sort of long rectangular box, which is basically the idea that all abstract objects exist in the category of non-individuals. Abstract objects do not exist within worlds. They don't exist within the category of possible individuals. They exist from, he uses the term, the standpoint of every world or worlds. So they don't exist within worlds, but they exist from the standpoint. They basically are outside of these sort of possible worlds, these concrete worlds. But
and is that like, I mean, it's just saying that there's Plato's
I was
heaven,
about to say that. So I mean, he wouldn't affirm a Platonic heaven, but you can visualize it to help us sort of as a heuristic to understand it. You can visualize it like, Plato's sort of heaven, where all these abstracts are existing above all concrete reality. That's probably the way to visualize it, but I don't think you'll affirm the reality of that sort of picture. But it's just the idea that these abstract objects, they exist in the third category of non-individuals, and they are not within a concrete world. They exist as abstract objects. And so well,
and that would be like numbers, properties, propositions, events, pure sets, or they are pure sets, he says, right?
So pure sets is basically the category that all these things fall within. He'll just basically call them sets, but they exist as abstract objects in that sort of specific way outside of the worlds. So we have this pluriverse. Pluriverse is everything that exists. Within the pluriverse, you have all these concrete worlds that fall into the possible individual category. You have impossible individuals, which are not so important, but they're just sums of all these possible worlds. And then you have non-individuals, which exist from the standpoint of every world, which is basically outside of each concrete world. So then just focusing more then with a concrete world. So you have these worlds. They exist within the pluriverse. They exist. Each world exists like our world, so they're each concrete, but they are spatio-temporally isolated, so there's no way, we don't share the same space as them, the same time doesn't exist in the same way maybe, and they're causally isolated, which is the key thing. We cannot causally affect each world, so each world is just by itself, isolated, and they cannot be related in any way. And so the key thing for him then is that given that and this is basically for this modality issue. So given that each world is spatio-temporally isolated, things exist within a singular world. So each entity is world-bound. So we exist in this world, but we do not exist in another possible world. And this is very key because it's very different from Plantinga, because Plantinga affirms transworld identity. So I exist, the same object myself exists in another possible world. Lewis does not affirm that. He disaffirms that. He says we are world-bound because each world is not causally or spatio-temporally related, and so we exist individually in each world. And so then the question is then, well, what's a truth maker then for the statement, I could have been a lawyer?
Right.
Well, it's not me because I don't exist in that other world where it's true that I am a lawyer. And so what he introduces is the idea of, it's called counterpart theory. So the idea that I have a counterpart of myself existing in another possible world. And so this counterpart is an exact duplicate of myself. So it looks like me. Well, not necessarily has to look like me, but the closest worlds to us, to our worlds in a way, closest in whatever sense you can say that, that individual would be very similar to me. Same skin color, same gender, same all of these things. But there will be something different in that the lawyer world, he's existing as a lawyer instead of a lecturer or philosopher or whatever. Or in another world, he exists as a window cleaner, or he exists as a car mechanic.
Yeah.
There's something different about each world because each duplicate is like me, but there's something different. That's why it's a duplicate. That's why it's not identical to me.
Mhm.
It's not numerically identical. So in each world, you have a counterpart of each individual. And so the counterpart then serves as the truth maker for each of the statements about myself. So things about me are not made true by myself, modal statements, but my counterparts are the things that make them true.
Mhm.
And so all of this is basically to serve Lewis's role, also his idea that we need to reduce modality. Because his idea was, he's a modal realist in his mind, but he wanted to reduce modal terms to non-modal things.
Mm-hmm.
Because he had a problem with, having primitive modality. Because, things about myself, possible statements about myself, modal statements about myself, are they things which are primitive, or can we reduce them? And he was trying to say we can reduce them. And so for him, it was reducible to these concrete worlds. And things about myself are reducible to counterparts about myself, counterparts of myself. And so de-re modality, things about myself, possible modal statements about myself, are made true about by other worlds and made true by counterparts of myself.
Yeah.
So statements about Hitler are made true. So Hitler won World War II. That's not made true by Adolf Hitler existing within our world. It's made true by another world and by a counterpart of Adolf Hitler.
Yeah.
So not Adolf Hitler in our world, but another Adolf Hitler who's not numerically identical to him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so man, there's so many things with Lewis's stuff, and this isn't an episode all about Lewis, but that to me that doesn't seem like de-re necessity, because it's not like it's not me. It's literally a counterpart. And so I don't know how this like arrow of necessity still tracks out. Like it doesn't seem like it's actually a rigid. Parker is not like a rigid designator, because I actually don't exist in even the closest possible worlds. It's my counterpoint. Any idea?
Yeah. So you have, this is a really famous objection raised by Saul Kripke.
Okay.
Against him. So it's called the Humphrey Objection. So if you have this sort of, let's use a more contemporary president, which maybe some people love, some people don't. So let's say Donald Trump, okay? Famous Donald Trump. So ex-president. And, statements about him, things about him, let's say he won, the last election. So he won the election now. So is it 2020? Would you call it? Sorry, 2021 election? Yeah, you'll call it that. So 2021 or
2021, but it doesn't start.
Where am I now? I'm lost in my timeline. So 2021 election. Well, it's not true, because he didn't win, unless you're a conspiracy theory, but he didn't win. Let's say he didn't win the 2021 election. Okay. But the statement that he could have won that election is made true by it being true in another possible world. Mm-hmm. But it's made true by the counterpart of Donald Trump. Yeah. But what Saul Kripke was trying to say is that there seems to be an intuition problem here. Because as you were saying, it's intuitively the case that it's possible that Donald Trump won this because Donald Trump actually won this in that possible world.
Right.
But if it's my brother, Donald Trump's brother, if he has a brother or someone else, it's not true that Donald Trump won it. It's true that his brother won it. Right. And a counterpart seems to be like a brother. It seems to be like something which is not Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And so why would we say Donald Trump won it? Because his brother won it. We wouldn't. And so just calling that brother a counterpart isn't going to help the matter, because it's not Donald Trump that did it. And so he was trying to say at an intuitive level, it seems to be the case that statements that are modal statements that are made true by Donald Trump need to be made true by Donald Trump and not by counterparts of Donald Trump, because those are not to do with Donald Trump. And so, it's basically an intuitive thing, but it's a very influential objection, because it doesn't seem to be the case that Donald Trump is serving as a truth maker when he should be serving as a truth maker of those de-re necessity or possibility statements. And so, you have problems here. Yeah.
You could just toss in, maybe not as easily as this, but toss in like a substance ontology and just say like, they're essences. They share the same essence. Then it'd be a counterpart in a certain sense, in that he has different experiences than this Parker does. Maybe he
Yeah.
sees kangaroos toppling over without tails or whatever
Yes.
Lewis wants to say. But
Yeah.
yeah, like if you have substances and essences, I see the DeRay stuff, but that's yeah, neither here nor there. Maybe when I have Kripke on or some.
Yeah. That'll be good.
Yeah, but okay,
Yeah.
one more, just really, and I'm sure someone
Yeah.
else has raised this, but it's like a Benesaraf problem in mathematics of like, how do we know abstract entities? So like, I haven't read much of Lewis, just looking at his counterfactuals book, but what, like, there's an epistemological thing going on where like, if these worlds are, um, maybe it's the problem of irrelevance or something, but if they are so isolated from each other, how can I know that there is a possible world where Donald Trump won the election? Like, is it just through intuition or?
Yeah, this is a really incisive point. So thank you for raising that. Yeah, this is one of the issues that Lewis tried to tackle, but I don't think wasn't sufficiently tackled by him. But that is one of the main objections against him. That
Okay.
how can you know of these things? Because it depends how you view epistemology, but there seems to be, in the belief process, our belief forming process, there seems to be the need for some sort of causal link between the thing that causes me to have the belief. There needs to be some form of a causal relation. But if I'm believing about some spatio-temporally isolated world, and those worlds are not causally related to ours, how can I really know anything about them? And so the way Lewis tried to tackle it was he basically just bit the bullet and said, well, if we do this for mathematical objects and we allow mathematics to, mathematicians to go on doing maths, why can't we do it in the modal metaphysics realm? So abstractor, yeah, exactly as you were saying, there's a problem of epistemology, how we know of these things. But he was just basically saying, well, if we allow mathematical objects to, get past this and we assume them, why can't we do the same thing? And so the reason why he was saying that is because he said, well, given that there is an economical sort of virtue that we can get from this,
yes,
the same way that we do that with maths,
yeah,
we can do the same with this epistemology, with this modal metaphysics, because he was saying, because we can reduce modality, and he was saying we have a more parsimonious ontology, because we are not saying there are all these primitive modal terms, but because we can reduce the modal to the non-modal, there's an economical value that we have here. And so we just need to bite the bullet and say, well, because mathematical objects are allowed to do that, and because there's great things happening there, we can do the same thing in our modal metaphysics.
Yeah. And so we have this qualitative parsimony in that we don't have all these different ways. Well, I mean, you're bringing out there are different ways of being, but we don't have all these things. We can reduce reduce modality to concreta. So there we go. Boom, no problem. But then he's got this weird, like, quantitative, not simplicity, right? Where it's just multiplied everything. Which it's like, what the trade-off? What do you want? You want qualitative or quantitative? And Lewis is like qualitative.
Yeah. So something interesting is that I've always, I'm always like, getting papers out, but this is actually a very interesting thing, because so there's a paper that's under review, which I hope comes out sometime. It's been for ages, where I try and actually argue for, how I've done with grounding. I'm trying to argue from the existence of possible worlds to God. And I think, using that same sort of thing of simplicity, background knowledge, and all these sort of things, I'm actually trying to say, well, if we affirm Lewis's ontology, his metaphysics, you have simplicity problems, you have fit with background knowledge, because we can't know of these things. And we have other issues with it. And so it seems to be the case that the simplest explanation for these things, if they exist, is God. And I try in the most laborious fashion, but I try and say he has a problem, because a lot of philosophers have tried to say, well, you have such a crazy ontology. Because as I didn't raise, but one of the key things for him, and I do bring out in the paper, is the idea that each world is actual. So, what you have with Plantinga is each of these worlds, or the people who hold to abstractionist, the abstract view of possible worlds, they would say there's only one actual world. Okay, the world existing is the one actual world. All of these worlds they exist in some way, but they exist as abstractor, but there's one world which is actual. But Lewis had the view that every world is actual, because for him, actuality is an indexical term, like now or something like that. And so for the utterer, each world is actual. So my counterpart in another world is existing in the same way that I'm existing in the actual world, because the world is actual for them. And so for him, so for philosophers who look at this, they have one of the main issues for him is this incredulous stare where people have looked at it. Just seems to be crazy that there is a world where there are unicorns and headless chickens running around, because for him, anything that's possible exists. So anything that you can think of that's possible exists. And so headless chickens are possible, and there's a world with headless chickens, there's a world with unicorns. And so the problem that you have is there is a parsimony problem. The way Lewis tries and deals with that is trying to make the distinction between qualitative and quantitative parsimony and simplicity. And so saying, yeah, quantitatively I've got this crazy ontology, but qualitatively I really don't, because they all fall into the same category. So yeah, that's the way he sort of deals with it. But you have a lot of philosophers who are just saying they can't really stomach it. Yeah.
Right. Well, and in his in answering the Benesraf problem and saying like, look, mathematicians don't have to do it, so neither do I. It's like, well, I think the best explanation is God over for the mathematicians. And so then just likewise, if that's the best explanation, then you just let God into your ontology. Like if sorry, Lewis, you know?
Yeah.
Exactly. But the like I'll let you do all the hard work on that stuff. So so getting back to using modal realism here in synthesizing classical theism and neoclassical theism, like how do you do that?
Yes. So yeah, before I just got to take one more step, important step.
Yeah.
Is that because it's important to make the step as well, because you don't want to use a crazy metaphysic that a lot of people are going to just from the onset say, this is crazy, so many problems. Why are we going to take a complex, crazy metaphysics and try and apply it to this issue when it's already been, thrown in the bin? Because a lot of philosophers don't affirm, and it's true, there is no one who affirms exactly what Lewis affirms about modal realism.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that modal realism, the category of modal realism, doesn't have other versions. The issue is because Lewis has been so influential, a lot of people just say, well, modal realism is Lewis's view of modal realism, when it's not. There's other philosophers, and exactly as I bring out in the paper, Chris McDaniel, who features in the ontological pluralism stuff, he also redeveloped modal realism in Lewis's sense. And you also have Philip Bricker, influential philosopher as well, who's also taken Lewis's view, and he said actually there's ways to deal with some of the objections that we bring. And so what I try and do in the paper is I try and bring Chris McDaniel and Philip Bricker's development of Lewis together. And I try and say, well, given this development, we have a plausible metaphysics which we can then apply to the God stuff. And so you don't have the objection of saying, let's just get, we're not even going to go investigate this because Lewis's stuff is crazy. So just in a nutshell, in the briefest way as possible, what I do basically is saying, well, Chris McDaniel, what he tries to do is to deal with that Humphrey objection. He tries and says, actually, what we need is modal realism with overlap. Because what you have with Lewis is modal realism with isolation. Each world is just isolated. But what he was trying to say is that actually we can have possible worlds overlapping, because the way we need to understand a possible world is not as a maximal mereological sum of everything. Because if you have that, then there can't be things that overlap. Possible world. But what he defined a possible world as, a concrete world, is each world is basically a world of spatiotemporal regions. So the way to understand a world is not a mereological sum of everything, but a world is basically a container of different spatiotemporal regions. And so then you have objects who occupy each region, but they can occupy different regions. So I, myself, Josh, I exist in this world because I occupy a certain spatiotemporal region, but the same Josh can exist in another world existing in another spatiotemporal region. And so we have distinct regions, but we can have numerically identical objects that occupy each of those regions. So what we have is modal realism, because we still have the concrete worlds existing there. But what we have then is each person is existing. It's possible that they exist in different worlds. And so each modal statement can be made true by myself, by a numerically identical myself existing in another world. And so you don't have that Humphrey objection, because Donald Trump did win the election in another possible world. It is Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And there is a living, breathing Donald Trump in that concrete world, but it's the same Trump. It's a numerically identical Trump. So you have that. So he deals with the Humphrey objection. But then there's still a problem with, and I'm not going to go into it, but you have a big problem with island universes with Lewis's view of actuality, that each world is actual. There's a problem there, and I won't really go into it. But what Bricker does is basically tries and says, similar to Plantinga really, that with each concrete world, there is at least one world that's actual. So not every world is actual. So Lewis was saying every single world is actual. Bricker develops this and says, actually, there's one world at least as actual. He's open to other worlds being actual, but there's at least one world.
Mm-hmm.
And so what he says is that a world is actual, not in an indexical way. Actuality is not an indexical term, but a world is actual if it bears a certain primitive special property. So our world, the actual world, bears the property of actuality.
Is it like a hexady?
I don't know if you'll take it that way. What would you sort of interpret?
Just like it's undescribable. You can't really it's just the thisness. Like
it could be. I mean, you could take in that sort of way. But it's just a primitive property that you can't define. You can't really understand it further, but there's something, it allows our world to fall into a different category than the other worlds.
Yeah. That's good.
A way that I'm going to develop this later is, I think, there is a different way of existing that our world has. So that ontological pluralism, you can sort of bring that in there and say, our world exists as an actual world. It exists in a different way than the other possible worlds. Even though they exist in a different way. So our world is special. That's why it's actual.
Yeah, you just need another existential quantifier.
It could be that. But also something I'm thinking of is McDaniel has a view not just of ways of being, but he has degrees of being. So things can exist in different degrees.
Yeah, so ours would be the most fully.
Yes,
it has the most degrees of.
Yes, that it could be that. So I'm thinking through that.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, then close worlds are a little bit less than us, but then further out you go.
Yeah, it could be like that.
Cool. That's
so.
Cool.
And I actually, we're thinking alike a lot, but I actually had that sort of book sort of analogy in my mind, because I was trying to make sense of this, saying, well, Bricker says there's all of these concrete worlds that exist like Lewis does, but our world is different because it's actual. Well, what's the difference there? And the way I was trying to think of it is like, if you have like a script, so you have a script and you have a movie.
Yeah.
Now, what happens is that the director, in a way, actualizes the script. It makes the script real.
Yeah.
But the characters exist. They exist already in the script in some way. They exist in some way. Or you can make it like let's say a picture book. They exist in the book in some way. But then when it's put in a movie, it's like it's actualized. Yeah. It's like it's animated. It's actually moving and breathing in some way. You know, you've got Spider-Man the comic, but then you have Spider-Man in the movies. Like there's some difference there, even though they exist both in these dimensions. And so what I was thinking was, you have that sort of with all of these worlds, they all exist, but there's one world that is actually animated, actually, it's actual in a way. There's something special about it. And so it's been, the script is being made real in a way. And I sort of get on later to God doing that thing.
Yeah.
But you have all of these worlds existing, but there's one that's actual. And that's what Bricker does in developing this. So I bring McDaniel and Bricker together and say, well, the way we can understand this modal realism is that there are all these infinite plurality of worlds which are defined as spatiotemporal regions, maximal regions. And you have all of these concrete objects that occupy these regions. And you can have more than one concrete object occupying more than one world. But there's one world, one maximal spatiotemporal region that is actual, and that is our world, even though there are all these other worlds that exist, but there's one that's actual. And that's what I sort of bring in. And just before I go on, sorry, I've been speaking for a bit.
This is good, dude. No, it's awesome.
Before I just move on to the theistic bit, this will deal with an objection that's been brought up against Lewis, because you have basically, there's a sort of research, area at the moment with theistic modal realism, where you have some philosophers. So Michael Almadia, I always struggle to pronounce the name, but yeah, I'll just go Almadia. And you have other philosophers who have utilized Lewis's modal realism and said, you know what, we can actually do some theological work with this. But what they do is that they assume Lewis's view of modal realism.
Yeah.
And one of the objections that's been raised, a really famous objection, has been, well, this counterpart idea, what do you do with God? Because if God exists in each of the worlds, then because you don't have overlap, you don't have one entity existing in more than one world.
Right.
If God exists in one world, because God is a necessary being, has to exist in all of the worlds, it has to be a counterpart of God.
Mm-hmm.
Because counterparts are the things that ground our modal statements, even on statements of necessity. So we have God G1 existing in one world. And then you have G2 existing in another world. You have G3 existing in another world. And then the problem that you have is, where's monotheism there? Because there seems to need to be, if you hold to monotheism, there's only one God. And it's quite funny that Lewis actually affirmed, even though he's an atheist, he affirmed some form of polytheism. Because he said, I think it was a joke, he was saying he's the most, polytheistic person in the world, because he does exist, that there is a God, and there has to be an infinite amount of gods in all different worlds
and different types. And in this world, this religion's true. In this world,
So it was quite interesting you were saying that. But I think you were saying that the God doesn't really exist in our world. So, but there's God in all these other worlds. So what you have is that a lot of people have said, well, there's an objection here, because if God exists in every world, there has to be counterparts of God. You can't affirm monotheism. Mm-hmm. So some philosophers have dealt with this. I don't know if it's possible just to bring up, I don't know if you have the image of, the pluriverse image that we had at the beginning.
Yeah.
Where you have all of the, I don't know if you can help with that.
Yeah, well, one second. I don't know if this helps. Does this help or no?
No, not that one yet. Okay. Sorry. Yeah, that one. So what some people have done, so if you have the God, you have the Lewis view of modal realism, you have God existing in one world, and you have a counterpart of God in each of those worlds. But then what some philosophers have done is that they said the way to deal with this is that God doesn't exist in each of the worlds. He exists from the standpoint of each world. Mm-hmm. So he exists outside of the worlds with pure sets, with the abstract objects. And so that does deal with the problem, because you don't need to say there's a God existing in each of the worlds as counterparts, because the one God exists from the standpoint of each world.
Yeah.
But then the problem that's been raised against that is that if God exists from the standpoint of each world, how can he causally affect each of the worlds? Because he's existing as abstract objects exist in their Platonic universe as such, and they have no
causally inert.
Yeah, so they have no causal relation to us. So how can he be doing anything or creating anything? And some people have there's some religious studies article where some people have said it actually leads to modal collapse. So, the famous modal collapse up, it can lead to that as well. So there's problems here. How do we assume this? So what I then do is I believe through molding, bringing together there's parts of Lewis's view, but mostly Chris McDaniel and Philip Bricker's modal realism, you bring them together, you can have a theistic modal realism that doesn't have these objections, and then ultimately allows us to deal with the theistic dilemma and the creation objection.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so real quick. So, man, so much good stuff here. So one thing is just, it makes so much sense to go downstream of Lewis. Like, if he's the founder of this idea, we don't always have to go back to the original, especially if his students have been advancing, or even if they weren't his technical students, like people have been advancing his ideas. Of course, you wouldn't just have to go with Lewis. Yeah. So I think that's a really great move. But then secondly, there's this, Koons and Pickavants brought up this, they call it the problem of isolation in their metaphysics book. And it's like Lewis wanted all these isolated worlds, but it seems like there's a meta world, which is straight up just the pluriverse, which is like connecting them all. So you want them to be isolated, but they're not. And so they've raised this as an objection, but it seems like why couldn't you just have God in the pluriverse? So then he's not in the abstract world. We don't have to worry about that. Maybe the abstract world exists in his mind if you're a conceptual realist or something like that, theistic conceptual realist. But can't he just be in the pluriverse, like outside all of the concrete worlds, but still within the concrete meta pluriverse?
But then what you might have is that entities, if they're existing, let's say in this concrete pluriverse where all the possible worlds are, they have to exist within a world. So they
But that
have
is
to,
the that
yeah,
is like the that well, and that's if Kuhn's and Pickavance's objection
yeah,
holds, then there is like a concrete
mm,
metaverse, which is the pluriverse itself is like a meta universe which contains all the. You know what I'm saying?
yes, yeah, yeah. So he, in a way, he exists above that. I mean, it
Yeah.
could be possible. That might be a way to develop this further as well.
Interesting. Okay.
The only thing is that you will have to divert quite far from Lewis's ontology, given that he had these three categories, and so things exist in each of these ways, either as a possible individual within a world, across worlds, but mereologically. But you don't really want to have God existing in that way, because then he's a sum
No.
of all these worlds.
Yeah, it's really
Or
weird.
he exists from the standpoint, but he didn't have that category where you can have things existing sort of in this metaverse. But that could be
Yeah.
a possibility. But again, like you said, we don't always have to hold so
Right.
strongly to what Lewis is saying.
Well,
But yeah,
actually, this one right here, this is helpful. So, like, um, the middle category where it's the oval around two
yeah,
worlds.
yeah,
I forgot the terminology.
yeah. So that's impossible individuals.
Yeah. So,
Impossible.
like, if
Yeah.
couldn't he just be an impossible individual, and the oval encompasses all concrete
Yeah.
universes?
So then what you'll have is that God would be the sum of all
Oh,
worlds.
so
So
that's the mereological
yeah, the
problem.
world will exist
Gotcha.
mereologically as parts of him. So
Gotcha.
that's been, so when people have gone into like theistic modal realism, they've looked at all the options and said, well, it doesn't seem that we don't want God within a world because there has to be counterparts of him. We don't want him as an impossible individual because he has to be made of these parts of worlds, which is really weird.
Yeah.
And so he might have to be at the standpoint, but then there's this sort of weird, how is he causally related? So there seems
Yeah.
to be problems. So I don't know if you want,
This set
yeah.
you up perfectly, dude. Now you
Yeah.
got to solve the problems here.
Yeah, so the way I sort of thought of it. Sorry, I don't know if you can go through. Maybe you can cycle through the images. So, yeah, just go back. Yeah, so go back one. Sorry, just go to the one where I had the red arrow. I think that
Yeah.
was that one. Sorry, so that's sort of the picture of the pluriverse of worlds that we have there. So what we have, okay, so the way I take this to be, and this will link later to the theistic ontological pluralism and deal with the theistic dilemma, is that instead of saying God exists in one of these categories as a possible individual or non-individual, I say he exists in both categories.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we can do that unproblematically. So firstly, with the possible individual category, we don't, because we're taking McDaniel and Bricker's view, which I've called Leibnizian realism with overlap.
Mm-hmm.
So the terminology is sort of stemming from McDaniel and Bricker. So you have just short way LRO. So you have the LRO view of modal realism, where each world allows for overlap. So you can have an entity existing in different worlds. So given that God can exist in different worlds, because the world is just a maximal spatio-temporal regions, God can occupy more than one region. And because he's a necessary being, he occupies every region in every world, across the world, sorry. So one region across each world. So he exists in each world.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the same God, numerically identical in each of the worlds. And so you don't have to have a counterpart because God
No
can overlap.
mereological problem because it's the same God.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same God, so you don't have the multiple gods problem. You can affirm monotheism because he exists in each of the worlds. And so you have that, you have that there. So he exists in each of the worlds. But then what we also have is that God exists from the standpoint of every world. So what I assume as well is that God is not only existing in each of the worlds, he also exists from the standpoint of each world. So he exists with the abstract objects. So in the paper, I don't know if you have it there, but in the paper, I have that both images. So you'll have G representing God existing in the middle of each world because he overlaps every world. He exists in every world. But then we also have God existing from the standpoint of every world. So God exists in the non-individual category and he exists in the possible individual category. And so we can have that. So we have our cake and eat it. So we have what Ross Cameron, so it was Cameron who first sort of suggested the way to deal with the multiple God stuff is because God exists from the standpoint of each world. And so I affirm what Cameron says and say, yes, God exists from the standpoint of each world. He exists with the abstract objects and he's not causally related at all. Okay, so he's not causally related. But then that doesn't have a causal problem for us, because we have God also existing within each world. He occupies each world. And so then he can causally act in each world, because he exists not just from the standpoint, but he also exists in each of the worlds as well. And so what you have, exactly, that's it. So thank you for that. So you have God, you can see in the standpoint box, he's existing there, but then you also have God existing within each world. He's overlapping each world. And so what you have then is God existing in these different categories. Now, then this fits exactly with ontological pluralism, because pluralism was trying to say that God has an abstract structure that he exists in, and he has a concrete structure that he exists in. He has an abstract way, and he has a concrete way of existing. And so what we have now is fitting Lewis's and McDaniel and Bricker's metaphysics. We then bring it together with the ontological pluralism. So the first question, which sort of led us down this path of modal realism, was saying, well, how can God exist as an abstract object and as a concrete object? He seems to only exist in one of these categories. But what we can have with this sort of development of modal realism is that God exists as a concrete object in each of the worlds, and he's multi-located in every world because he's a necessary being. But then God exists in an abstract way as an abstract object from the standpoint of each world. So he's not existing within each world in that specific way of being. But sorry, just to sort of deal with something, I just raised something which I want to correct my language. He doesn't exist as an abstract object, actually. He's not an abstract object, but he exists in the same way or the same status as an abstract object. So he's not a number, he's not abstract like a number, but he exists in the same way as a number, as a status of one. So that's one way of him existing, and another way of him existing. Sorry, I don't know if you have the image of dealing with the theistic dilemma. If not, I can just run it out. Yes, okay, so exactly now. So what I then do is then say, okay, let's now try and be even more fine-grained in our speech when we're dealing with the theism dilemma. Because what we can do now is, instead of saying God has an abstract way of being and a concrete way of being, we can use more traditional language, and it allows us to do this within the modal metaphysical sort of picture that we're utilizing and painting. Because what we have, in traditional theology, we say God exists transcendently and he exists immanently. But what you see a lot of the time in systematic books and other books is, what does that mean? What does it mean for God to be transcendent and immanent? Transcendence, normally God exists beyond the world. And immanent is that he exists within the world. But how does that make sense? Well, within the modal sort of realism view is that we can have this here, this LRO sort of picture, because God exists immanently in that he exists within each of the concrete worlds. Every single world that exists, he exists in each of them. That's what it means for him to be immanent. He is within each of the possible worlds. For him to be then transcendent is for him to exist from the standpoint of every world. So every single world that exists, he exists outside of it from the standpoint of each world with the other abstract objects. So what we say then with the ontological pluralism language is that he has a transcendent way of being. That abstract way of being is now understood as a transcendent way of being because he exists from the standpoint of every world. But then he also has an immanent way of being, which used to be the concrete way of being. He exists in an immanent way because he exists within each of the possible worlds, within each of the categories of possible individuals. He exists in each of the concrete worlds. So then, what we can then say, dealing with the theism dilemma, using what we did before, this relativization to a way of being, what we have is that in God's transcendent way of being, we have him being simple, timeless, immutable, and impassible. And in his immanent way of being, we have him being complex, temporal, mutable, and possible. And so this is not an ad hoc move, because we can make sense of this as well. So I try and bring this out in the paper. Because in his transcendent way of being, as from the standpoint of every world, with the abstract objects, God is simple, because abstract objects are normally understood to be simple in some way. They are not made of parts. And so if God exists in that sort of way, in this sort of, this standpoint of every world, he exists without any parts. He doesn't have to have any parts,
Mm-hmm.
even though there might be some abstracta that do, if some people say, but he doesn't have to. There's no requirement for him to be. He can be non-complex without any proper parts, existing in that specific way. Timeless, because abstracta are normally understood not to be part of our temporal sequence. They're normally not located within time. They normally don't have temporal extension. So God exists from the standpoint of every world as a timeless being like the abstracta do. Immutable. We don't have one becoming two. We don't have three becoming six. Okay, we don't have these abstracta changing. They seem to be immutable entities that don't change in any way. And so they are existing in that way, and God can also exist in that way. And impassible, because abstracta are causally inert, they are not causally affected. So they are not changing in their emotional states or causally affected in any way. They are existing from the standpoint of every world, and so they're not connected to the worlds in any way. So God can exist in this transcendent way of being from every standpoint, of the standpoint of every world, in these specific ways. But then because God has an immanent way of being as well, he exists within each world, each of the concrete worlds, he can be complex. He can be made up of properties, as all entities are. So McDaniel would say each region we have properties. And so God occupying a region would have the property of being, an occupier of the spatial region or spatio-temporal region. And so he would have properties. He would be complex. He will be temporal, because each of the worlds, each of the spatial regions are temporal. There's a temporal sequence. There's an extension and location he would have within each of the world. He will be mutable, because he can be, he can change, because there would be causal relations that he can stand in, because he's in some relation to a region. He might be part of an occupier of another region. He might, whatever. He can
have tense knowledge. And
yes, all these sort of things. So he can have all of these mutable sort of states that he falls into. And then passible as well, because he will be part of a region, he'll be able to be causally affected by things in other regions. And so what we have is a grounding, a more fuller, robust metaphysics that we can now attach to this ontological pluralism strategy and say, in its transcendent way of being, from the standpoint of every world, God is simple, timeless, immutable, and impossible, and in his immanent way of being, from him existing as a multi-located entity within each of the concrete worlds, he is complex, temporal, mutable, and possible. So we can have him existing in this way. And sorry, just one last point.
Yeah.
To motivate this anyway, wouldn't we want to, I didn't bring this up in the paper, but to motivate this, just saying God is omnipresent, wouldn't we want to say he exists in any part of reality that exists?
Yeah, I wrote that one down. Well, I go with immensity, because I think immensity is more deeper than but same thing, right? Depending on how you parse it. But if God is immense, he fills, not in, he's not physical, but if God is immense, if, like, as Turretin and everyone wants to say God is immense before the modern era, then wouldn't he have to feel like that's part of his nature?
Yes, exactly. So we would want to affirm this anyway. And so we have that. We can say that God exists. Yeah, he exists wherever these abstracts exist. If they exist from the standpoint of every world, God is there. And he's also within each world. And so we have that there already. We'll want to affirm that. And so we can cash that out within this metaphysics. And because we're going with the LRO view, we're not taking a crazy metaphysics. We're not saying you have to affirm the actuality of everything. No, everything exists in a possible way, but they're merely possible things. And this is, sorry, to raise something up. I mean, the camps are, you go with modal realism a lot of the time. And let's say you affirm, so Plantinga will call himself a modal realist, and he does. And so if you go with Plantinga or you go with Lewis, you're affirming the reality of modality. Okay, unless you say, they don't exist, these things. But what Plantinga actually says is all of the abstracta exist. So it's not far from this LRO view. He just says all of these abstracta exist, all of these states of affairs, they exist, and he's explicit in that. And they exist in the Platonic realm, they all exist. But there's only one of them, one state of affairs, which is actual, which obtains. But this is not far from the LRO view that I'm trying to say here, because we're saying all of these, instead of them being abstract objects, they're concrete, they all exist. But there's only one of them, which is actual. So it's very similar to his view. But
also, that's where, I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to ask you about that, because it did seem like that, just that they're concrete. But if you have different, as you said, you wanted to cash out that they have different levels of existence or whatever, then maybe some are,
Yeah. So that's something I just want to affirm. So it's not like if you're going with this, you're just, all you're doing is just saying, instead of the abstract, the concrete. That's all you're saying. But is there a big problem in saying that? Because there's only one of them which is actual. There's only one of them that has that special category that we want to say our world has. So there's no actual world where there are, talking donkeys and talking snakes, which was the problem for Lewis, because he has to say, that world is actual like ours. But this LRO view, maybe I need to change the terminology. But this view, this specific modal realist view, allows you to affirm the same sort of thing you'll do with Plantinga's view, but you're just saying they're concrete. And I don't see there's a big problem in doing that. But by doing that, we can have so much theological fruit that comes from this, because you can deal with this dilemma, which is right in front of us. We can have, God being classical in the way we want him to be classical. God is simple, he's timeless, immutable. So it's not a lie when you say God is simple, timeless, immutable, and impossible. And you're not also lying if you say, but he's also complex, temporal, immutable, and possible. Because again, we always have to relativize what we're saying to each way of being. And in our speech, we do that. So we can say, God is all of these things in his transcendent way of being, in this abstract transcendent way of being. But in this concrete, immanent way of being, God is these things. And so the Bible is true when it's saying this about God. But tradition is true when it's saying this about God. But now what we need to do is just be more fine-grained in our speech. And the metaphysics that I'm trying to say here allows us to do that. It allows us to go forward.
So I'd think of like J.C. Beale's recent work. This isn't making God a contradictory being.
No, not at all.
Just there's two ways of being. So, but you can refer to God. The one, you can refer to God and say there's two different ways of being. But you don't have to put those together and say that's contradictory. I think JC or Dr. Beale would want to do that and say, but you just are affirming a contradiction, even if you can flesh out why it's a contradiction. You're still. And I'm like, no, I think the qua move is legit. I think it does keep us from doing that.
Exactly. So there's no contradiction to be had here. So I would not affirm the idea that we can. I don't. I don't really like that view, because I think it's just problematic, and it opens up a can of worms that we don't want to be opened. But there's no contradiction there, because there is a qua, there is a relativization. So I'm not just saying God is simple and complex. Maybe that will be contradictory. I'm saying God is simple in this specific way, and God is complex in this specific way. So there's a changing of the subjects there. That's the key thing with this move. The subjects are different. The way of beings are different. Because I'm predicating simplicity to God in this way of being, I'm then predicating it to a different subject in this way of being. So that's the key thing.
And that's good. And I think you like PVI says, look, we have to have relative counting. There's no when it comes to the oneness, threeness problem of the Trinity, he's like, well, that's because you've thrown out the ability of or the relativizing counting. There's in one way he's three, in one way he's one, and so I think if you were to say no, there's got to be one, it's going back, it's assuming ontological monism to say no, there's one thing here, and you can't relativize this speech. You can't use different existential quantifiers. It's like, well, that's the debate. Then you need to make that argument instead of just assuming it and saying now he's a contradictory being.
Exactly. And that's my main thing, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take defensible metaphysics and say, well, let's take this defensible metaphysics in that it's not some wacko philosophers come up with this, but there's a defensible metaphysics here given by McDaniel and Turner. There's a defensible metaphysics not specifically from Lewis, but from McDaniel and Bricker's development of it. And let's take this and apply it here. And now, if you have a problem with the application, either you can say the application doesn't fit, or you have to take it up with the philosophical position. But like I said, it's defensible. McDaniel has given countless ways to defend ontological pluralism, and he's done the same thing with this modal realism. And Bricker, even more so, has done this with the modal realism as well. So if you have a problem, either you have to take it up with my own application of it in a theological context, or, and I don't see how that can be done. I don't see it's problematic. Or you have to take it up with the philosophical position, which you'll have to go and then raise objections with the metaphysics itself, which is a tall task, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so a couple things just following up. So
Yeah.
we you made the synthesis between two conceptions, both of which seem to be motivated if you are, you know, not classical. What's the word you use? If you're a traditionalist,
Yes. Yeah.
you have these two more. So we have the synthesis here. What about the creation problem? Have
Yes.
we
Yeah.
have we
Perfect.
solved that one?
Yeah, we do. So if you just go to the image, the one that has a red arrow,
Mhm.
so the one with the box and then the red arrow, that sort of, yeah, that exact one. So what we have here, because I'm taking this LRO modal realism view, I am not affirming what Lewis says that each world is actual. Because if you have that, then it doesn't seem to be the case that God has any freedom in, bringing about any world. Because the key thing here is that each of the infinite plurality of worlds, in general, the modal realist sort of framework, each of the plurality of worlds necessarily exist. They all exist necessarily. Okay. Now, what we have there then is, how does God have any freedom? How can he bring about things? Now, the creation objection was trying to say that it seems to be the case that God begins to be related to creation when he brings it about. But how can you hold to that? How can you hold to that within this sort of view, specific modal realist view? So the way that I deal with the creation objection, and I try and say, because God exists in these two ways, because God exists from the standpoint of each world, and God exists from, within each world, he's immanently within each world. We don't have the creation objection here, because God, in sort of the second premise, it says that God begins to be related to creation. But we don't have that, because the transcendent way of being, God is not related to creation at all, because he's existing from the standpoint of creation. He doesn't bring creation into existence from that specific standpoint, from that way of being. He doesn't begin to be related. And so, because in that standpoint, from that standpoint, in that way of being, that transcendent way of being, he simply is immutable, impassable, and timeless. He's not related to creation in any way. So this allows us to affirm what all these, classical theologians were saying. We can affirm all of God being all of these things. He doesn't change. He's not related, or in any way. There's no real relation from that specific standpoint, from that way of being. But because God has another way of being, because he exists within another ontological structure within each concrete world, we can have him then creating every world. But the key thing here is, because each world necessarily exists, what we have is that God's creation is properly understood as his actualization of one of the worlds.
Mm-hmm.
So, because each of the worlds necessarily exists, because I love grounding, I believe that God necessarily grounds each of the worlds. So each of the worlds within his immanent way of being, in each of the worlds that he exists, he grounds each of those worlds. So this world, God is grounding in this world in existence. And you have this for each of the possible worlds in which he exists within. But there is only one world, our world, which has a special category of being actual. And it is God who freely chose to actualize that world. He said, okay, the way I see it is that, sort of the picture you can have is that God is surveying, all the infinite worlds and saying which world is better, blah, blah, blah. And let's say there's a specific threshold of value. So there's some worlds where, there's all these rabbits that are killing each other, and everyone's murdering each other. God doesn't want that world. There's another world where evil again is not really good, and Hitler won World War II, and God doesn't want that. And there's this world which is, great, but it's not so good because there's problems here. But then there's our world, which has maybe some bad things and evil and all these things, but there's also good in our world. So it passes the threshold of value. So let's say there's this threshold of value, and I wouldn't affirm that there's a best world. So our world is not a best world, because there is no best world.
Sure.
But let's say there's a set of worlds that pass the threshold of value. God then decides, I'm going to actualize this world. And this is how sort of the analogy of, the script making. So let's say you have the director having all these scripts in front of him. Okay. Let's say, director of Harry Potter had all of these Harry Potter scripts in front of him. They said, I don't like that one. I don't like that one. I don't like that one. Okay, this one looks good. Or maybe Harry Potter's not a good one because that's a book. Okay. So he doesn't have a lot of wiggle room. Let's go with just any Inception or something. Okay. Old movie, Inception, all these different, Inception sort of scripts. And then he decides to choose that one and says, you know what, I'm going to make that one into a movie and not all of these ones where the character was doing this. And that's what God did with the infinite plurality of worlds. All of the worlds necessarily are grounded and they exist. But there was one world that he chose to actualize, and that was our world.
Mm-hmm.
And so it fits again with the Plantingian view that God actualized one state of affairs.
Yeah.
But it allows us to say that all of these worlds necessarily exist. And so something I think was raised, so it wasn't Joe Schmidt himself, but someone who I think I might converse with Joe Schmidt, or I don't know what something, but he said that there's a modal collapse here, or God doesn't have free will. I think
that's kind of what I was thinking. Just real quick, so it seems like these worlds might be emanations, or they exist maybe ungrounded. You're the grounding guy, right? So like, it's more like God had a choice to from options instead of God had like what we think of as creative choice.
Yeah. So the way what I'm saying creation should be understood within this metaphysical framework is not the creation of a world, because each world exists. They all exist. They're all there.
Necessarily, yeah.
But what
not in
it
the
is,
same way. Yeah.
Yeah. They all exist necessarily. But what creation is understood, creatio ex nihilo, is not the creation of a world out of nothing, but it's the creation of a kind of world. So a world now becomes different in kind. So you had all these worlds, but then there's one world that now is elected, and now is said, this is the world, and now it has a special ontological status. So then what we have is that God's creative sort of agency, he has free will here, because he freely can choose any world that he wants to actualize.
Yeah.
Even though all of the worlds exist, his freedom is to be understood as him actualizing one specific world and making this world real. And when I further cash this view, without sort of the theological context, but the philosophical of it, if we have maybe the McDaniel stuff, we can have God actually, the actualization is a big move here. It's not, him just saying, this world, come on. It's actually
not like a vending machine.
It's not that. But it's actually saying this world is real. The other worlds don't have reality in the same way. Even though they're there, they don't have reality in the same degree. So there's something special that he does with this world. And so what this then has with the creation objection, we have God beginning to be related to a world. But it's not that he begins to be related to a world that wasn't there. The worlds are there. But he's related to a world in a different way. When we understand it, is that his real relation that he begins to have is of a kind. It's a kind relation. So he was related to this world, but this world wasn't actual. They were all merely possible. Then at some point, whenever, God decided to actualize one world, and there was a new relation that he had, a relation to an actual world, not to a merely possible world. And so what we have here is there is a creation taking place, but it's a creation that we need to understand differently. And this might be difficult for people to stomach, because they will be like, but we want creation really out of nothing, where there was absolutely nothing, and then there was something coming into existence. And that's a fair objection. If you want creation ex nihilo understood in that way, but does it necessarily have to be understood in that way? Because again, I think I would pull the Lewis card and say the economical value we have here, because he's all about the utility of the metaphysics. And I think we have the utility of the metaphysics here, because what's more important to us? Affirming the concept of God as simple as all of these things, and as complex and as timeless and as temporal. All of these things we can have within this metaphysical framework. But all we have to stomach is reinterpreting creatio ex nihilo, not getting rid of it, not saying, no, there's no creatio ex nihilo, but there is a creatio ex nihilo, but we need to understand it a little bit differently, maybe weaker than the way. I would say there's more virtue taking that view than saying, you know what, we have to have these warring camps of neoclassical theists and classical theists. You can't be both. You have problems here. And we have the Theism Dilemma, because the scripture says this, but this says this. Because at the end of the day, the neoclassical theists will say they will laugh at the interpretations. Even though I affirm the classical, they will laugh at the interpretations of the classical, saying that's stretching it. It's clear that the verse doesn't say that. But then the classical will say, well, your view is a new view. The church has always affirmed this. So what I'm trying to say to you is that if we take this metaphysical picture, we can have our cake and eat it. We can really have God being in these specific ways. We can have what scripture says. We can have what tradition says. And we can have it in the literal sense of the word. We don't have to reinterpret scripture. We don't have to reinterpret tradition. We can have Aquinas. We can have Swinburne. They can be best
Yeah.
buds. You can have both of them within
Yeah.
this view.
Yeah.
Specifically, yeah.
Well, you might not be able to have Swinburne because you say God's a necessary being, and
Yeah.
I don't think he says that, right? But
Yeah.
without that, so
Yeah.
the I think I'm still like questioning here. What are those? What are the truths of those? I don't know if you want to say truths or counterfactuals, right? It's like the grounding objection for Molinism. What are those possible worlds? The truths therein. What are those grounded in?
Okay. What do you mean? Sorry, just to further
Yeah,
understand.
so it seems
Yeah.
like they are necessarily, but they're necessarily existent. What in one world, Parker has a cat, and in another world he has a dog.
Yeah.
What I want to say, like God, chose me to have a cat. First, God didn't choose me to have a cat, right? Like
Yeah.
but you would say he actuated a world in which I had a one or the other.
Yeah.
But there's like counterfactual truths in these other worlds,
Yeah.
and it seems like they're just like they might be just free floating out there if
Yeah.
they weren't up to his creative
Yeah.
activity.
Yeah. But I mean, so these truths, these statements are made true by those worlds. But and yet, so they're grounded. The truth makers are each of the occupants of those worlds and the worlds themselves. So
Hmm.
you having a cat in one world, you having a dog in one world. Um, but at the end of the day, the question is, do we really care about those worlds because they don't have the same status as the world that we have? And so just changing the view and going to the normal abstractionist planting a,
Yeah,
Adam's view, which a lot of people assume, you have the same thing though, because you have statements being made true by different them being, would he use the word existing, but them being made true in different states of affairs.
yeah,
So in one state of affairs, you have my individual essence existing where I have, a dog. And in another state of affairs, I have, my individual essence
yeah,
having, a cat or whatever. And so what you have is you have those truth makers being made true by the individual essences of those entities in those different states of affairs. However, God chooses to allow one state of affairs to obtain, the one where I have a dog. And so you have the same thing. Like there's
yeah,
no difference there because all those things are existing and made true by those states of affairs. But there's one state of affairs that obtains.
yeah.
What you have in this view is you have all of the worlds existing, and one of them is just actualized. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe my problem is with just a wrong interpretation of the abstractionist view, which, like you said, most people take for granted, or when they learn about this, they go right to that one,
Yeah.
which I have. And I think the abstract worlds, state of affairs, propositions seem more readily like conducive to God's creative productive activity. Like God
Yeah.
took abstract propositions and put them all together, or when he was thinking up possible worlds, they're still like the result of his creative productive activity. It
Yeah.
seemed maybe push that and say that's not actually what's up, and if that's the case, that's good. But on the concrete view, it seems like there's all these worlds that they just are, and
Mhm.
it's not grounded in his creative activity.
Yeah. But then you will have the same thing with the abstractionist view
Okay.
because you will have all of these states of affairs not that they're existing necessarily. And even Planting in his small book, Does God Have a Nature?
Yeah.
He would say all these abstract objects are timeless. They are, they're eternal. They're necessary. So
Hmm.
given that they're eternal and necessary, so I know he takes it to be thoughts in God's mind.
Hmm.
So that just depends how you have your, how you can have,
Yeah.
abstract objects and all those sort of things. But if we just go with the general Platonic view, you will have all of these necessarily existing eternal states of affairs, which are not grounded in God. They just exist as they are.
Yeah.
But then one of them obtains and maybe becomes concrete in some way. But then again, you have an issue that I was raised by Lewis against Plantinga's view, which I think has force, and it's how do these abstract objects, these states of affairs, why do they represent the things that they're supposed to represent?
Hmm.
So, and you had this view, this was also with Lewis as well. Plantinga raised the same thing with Lewis. But how do these states of affairs work in the way that they do? why do they represent reality in the way that they do? What's the reason that they do? And it gets, I really don't want to go deeper.
Yeah, right. It's another 2 hours.
But yeah, it is. But there's, so the Lewis objection is how, how does how does the state of affairs, how is it related to the actual world?
Mhm.
And it gets really complicated, but he's like, you can get all these things working because the way our world works, you just say the other possible worlds work in that same way.
Mhm.
They just work in the exact same way. But how do you have states of affairs doing the job that they do, that Plantinga wants them to do, to represent the way that they do and form these possible worlds?
Yeah.
And even how does God make them to do that? I mean, there's a metaphysics that needs to be there. So how does God get these things which work in some way? How do they start working in a concrete way, in the way that our world does? But what you have with this view is saying we have concrete reality existing necessarily. It's there. But what we then have is we simply have this world having a special thing that God does to it.
Mhm.
He does a new act that he didn't do. It wasn't having, wasn't there before. But again, this is a new view because the main people who are working on theistic modal realism, they assume Lewis's view, and so they stomach the view that God doesn't have free will, because God necessarily brings about all of these possible worlds, and each of them are actual. What I'm trying to say is that we can have some form of free will, because at the end of the day, God doesn't have free will like us. So
Amen.
God has a limited, we have free will because we can choose between good and bad. God can't, he can only choose good. So we have a limitation to God's free will anyway. We have a qualification of it. So there's a even further qualification here that God does have free will, but what his freedom does when it comes to creative sense is actualization and not bringing about of a possible world.
Yeah. And you have a range of good worlds that he could pick from, because best possible worlds, conceptually impossible.
Exactly, yeah. And just the last thing on this, and this view as well is more helpful, because how do you have God being related to these abstract objects? Because at the end of the day, God didn't bring them into existence. So how is there a grounding relation? Because grounding is a relation of metaphysical causation, the way I interpret it and the way some philosophers interpret it. But these abstract objects are causally inert, so they can't be in any grounding relation with God. So they're just these free floating things.
Wait, they don't. If you're like a modified theistic activist, you'd say God did bring these things about, but they don't have causal powers. The causal powers are grounded in an agent, and so he can, right? So they don't need causal powers in and of themselves.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, there'll be ways to modify it and ways to do this, but I would again want to understand the causal relation better between these things.
Sure.
So is it causation in the way that we understand it? Can causation have as relative, these types of objects? I will want to know that. But what I'm trying to say is that at the face value, we can have causation and we don't have to reinterpret it. Because my problem I have a lot of the time with theology and philosophy is that we have to always reinterpret things to fit into our box.
Right.
But what we can have here is causation, because God grounds each of these worlds, because each of these worlds can be, the inputs or the outputs of these types of things, because they're concrete. But can we necessarily have that with these abstract objects? That's a question that we need to see, and we need to understand the relation better. And so we can have causation, we can have grounding here. Each world is grounded by God. God is the source of each world. He's the necessary eternal source, because they didn't come into existence, but he's still the fundamental ground of each world. But he also has some counterfactual freedom, because what he does is that he decides to bring about one world in an actualization move, which also Plantinga would say is what God does. He actualizes a world. I say the same thing here.
Yeah. Dude, that's great, because I think you've set up a really important and potentially illuminating debate between abstractionists concerning possible worlds, theistic abstractionists, and theistic concretists like yourself, which you may be the singleton set is you. It might just be you out here right now, but maybe people listening, that's really interesting, because you want to push them and say, look, I think usually they say, look, God's immaterial, and like you just kind of slap it there, and it just kind of intuitively, but you don't really cash it out. And you're saying, look, I have one that is further developed, so now it's back on you guys to make sense of it. I think that's a great point, man. That's really helpful, I think, in moving the conversation forward, that maybe people didn't even realize needed to be.
Yes. Yeah, no, I do appreciate that. And just to emphasize the point is, what I'm trying to do is just take what is available and what's defensible. So not just what's available and defensible, and say actually there can be fruit, had here when it comes to theology. And so, we can have a little bit more peace between a classical theist and a neoclassical theist, because you can be both. You just need to, be able to also assume this ontology and metaphysics, and maybe it's possible to do that. And that's sort of my aim.
Wow, man. We went in deep and far. This is awesome. I think there's still tons more. I think there's if you're a semantic externalist, you might have a problem with your concepts referring to other things, but most people aren't. So there's that. But I think the authorial, what you're doing, I want to read more, and I want to connect with the authorial analogy, because I think it fits really nicely in saying there's God, the author, outside the text, and God who represents himself well, but inside the text, and he can have genuine relations. And I think it's cool. I think it's actually biblical. Going from the theological and the metaphysics, and I want to talk more about this, man. I really appreciate the work you're doing, and even though it blows my mind every single time, I got to listen back like 3 times to this.
No, thank you. And you're an amazing host. So really bring out the best in your guests. So
thanks, man.
Thanks. I really, really do appreciate it. And thanks so much for having me on again.
So well, dude, I appreciate all your time. I will link to your paper. Where's the best place people can read more of your work, though?
So all my stuff is on academia. I know that one you can get thousands of emails, so I do apologize if you have to download it and get those things. But I do upload most things on there when I have a copy or pre-pub or something like that. So people can go on there, or you can always reach me on Facebook. I'm always willing to have a conversation with people. But thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, definitely, man. And if you guys want to have more conversations with myself and my guests, check out the Facebook group, Parker's Pensées, Pensées. Find us there. I'll let you in, all that good stuff. So that'll be fun. Josh, thanks again, man. This has been huge. I got to go take a nap or something.
Everyone does, I think.
But that's going to have to do it for now, folks. Thanks for tuning in. If you want to support me, you can support me on Patreon. You can find a link in the description. And buy a shirt and go to Biblios or Biblios clothing, and you can get that 10% discount, get an awesome shirt like this one. All right, that's gonna have to do it. Peace.